Okay, so chapter 7, if you have your Keller book, go ahead and take that out. If you don't, you can grab one if you need to. So we're in chapter 7 of Keller, right? That's what you read, right? Already got that? Okay. I know. So let's talk about the Gnostic. Let's begin by talking about the Gnostic Gospels. What were the Gnostic Gospels, or what are the Gnostic Gospels? Wait, what? Yes. Yeah.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, John.
So those are the Gospels. The Gnostic Gospels. Yeah.
Were they more recently written, later written accounts, I guess?
Of the life of Christ, yeah. And they were purportedly written, there's the Gospel of Thomas, there's the Gospel of Peter, but they were written in the 200s at earliest. So could Thomas have written the Gospel of Thomas? No. Could Peter have written the Gospel of Peter? No. So you have these Gospels, these accounts of the life of Christ, written far after the events. And they tell a different story than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I can't remember if it's Peter or Thomas, but you've got this like huge talking cross in it. Did it talk about this in the book? This huge talking cross and Jesus's head like is so big that it goes up to heaven, and just a lot of very mythical sort of ideas. When I was in college, we read Rudolf Bultmann, and Rudolf Bultmann wrote the God and Mythology, something like that, and he was claiming that the Gospels were that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were mythological. Well, Thomas and Peter and those Gnostic Gospels definitely were mythological. The Gospels that we have, and Rudolf Bultmann lived quite a long time ago, so he might not have had as much understanding of the proof that we have of the early writing of the Gospels. But they were all written within a generation of Jesus living and dying and rising again. So the Gnostic Gospels were not did not give the correct story. Although if you ask Dan Brown, the author, I'm sure he talked about that in here. He would say that they did. I don't know what page this is on. It's on page 100 for me, but it's where it says we can't trust the Bible historically. Page 103. It's widely believed that the Bible is a historically unreliable collection of legends. How do we know that it's not? It's not legend. Yeah. Okay, that's one thing, that we have non-biblical writings to tell the basic story. Yeah.
There's way too many details compared to legend.
Yeah, legend doesn't give details. When you read that kind of writing, it doesn't give details. It gives a bigger picture. What else? I'm missing one of the most important. How does a legend take hold? Yeah. A legend doesn't take hold until everybody who was there at the time is dead. And their children, and maybe even their grandchildren, are dead. Because there's now nobody to say, that never happened. If I were to tell you that when Mr. Hood was in high school, he was a punk rock star. And he had videos, he had purple hair, lots of purple hair. Could I get away with that? Not just because of the story. I mean, it could happen. I mean, it really could happen, right? But he's there to combat it, right? His wife, who was they went to college together, is there to combat it. I'm sure all kinds of people at Northwestern that would be like, no, dude was a geek, right? And so it would take generations for that to be believed, because there are eyewitnesses that can disprove it. And so the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are far too early to be legend. And then they're also far too specific to be legend. There's a line in the Gospel of John when Jesus, or when Peter chops off the servant's ear, and John names the servant, Malchus. That's the kind of detail that's and it's throughout John and throughout the Gospels. We see these earmarks of an eyewitness, and that's one of them. You remember those details. You remember that name. It wasn't someone that he particularly knew. It wasn't his brother, but he remembered the name. And you do. I think about memories that you have from 5, 10 years ago, and you still remember maybe what it smelled like, right, or what it looked like, or who was there, and you can name those people. And that's an earmark of an eyewitness. So the Canonical Gospels were. I'm on. It's probably on page 104 for you. Canonical Gospels were written at the very most 40 to 60 years after Jesus' death. Again, far too soon to be legend. Look this up over here. Oh, it's probably in your book. Turn to page 264 in your book. Your big atheist. Sorry. I made a note on that. Maybe not. Is there a note at the bottom of that?
It's just supposed to.
Okay. I must, yeah, it must be in this book, but I don't see it there. Now, what about the fact that they quote Jesus? And people say, that can't be right. Nobody could remember that word for word. How could they do that? Yeah. It was an oral culture. The vast majority of Jewish males had the entire Old Testament memorized. That's, to us, we're not an oral culture. We're a written culture. And when you add to that that students required to memorize their rabbi's teaching, their teacher's teaching, it would make perfect sense. And we don't have everything that Christ said written down, right? But some of that he might have told them over and over and over. Right? So it's not as unbelievable as we think it is, because our culture isn't an oral culture. But the committing to memory the teaching of your rabbi was just standard practice. Still that way? Memorize everything I say. No, I don't know. Oh, never mind. I don't. And then they name names. The Gospels name names of people. How is that dangerous to do? Yeah.
So it's not true, and you're reading that, and like
Yeah. Yeah. If I say someone was at the basketball game last night that wasn't, or say I was at the basketball game last night and I wasn't, that's pretty easy to disprove, isn't it? No, you weren't. I was there and you weren't there. Oops. And so it would have been foolish for them to name names if they weren't telling the truth. If they were wanting the story to be believed, and clearly they were wanting the story to be believed, then the stupidest thing they could do was to name names. But they did name names because that was the truth, right? And you better be telling the truth if you're going to do that. So it says, and I'm on page 102, so probably somewhere around page 105 for you guys. It would have been impossible then for this new faith to spread as it did had Jesus never said or done the things mentioned in the gospel accounts. And I'm skipping down, if there had not been appearances after his death, if there had not been an empty tomb, if he had not made these claims and these public documents claimed they happened, Christianity would have never gotten off the ground because too many people would have known it was a lie. It never would have spread because everybody else who was there would say, never happened, don't believe it. So the 4 canonical Gospels were written much earlier than the so-called Gnostic Gospels. And then he goes through and talks about the Gospel of Thomas and others. So some people say that those Gnostic Gospels weren't chosen because the church was biased against them, and the church wanted to have a power grab, and by that I mean the Catholic Church wanted to have a power grab, and so they were choosing those books. That couldn't be farther from the truth. First of all, they weren't chosen because they weren't true, and they weren't written by eyewitnesses. And we can see even in Scripture, gentlemen, are we paying attention? We can see even in Scripture that that Peter calls the writing of Paul Scripture, and so we can see even within the time that the Bible was being written that that others thought that those writings were authoritative. And we certainly see by the early 100s with Polycarp and Irenaeus and others that they saw almost all of the books, the 27 books of the New Testament, as reliable as Scripture and as God breathed. Now, the choosing of those 27 books is a long story, and we'll spend a lot of time on it next year. We'll spend some time on it next year. But just know that there wasn't a church council that sat down and said these 27. It happened over time. And the first canons that were written out, the Muratorian Canon is the first one that was written, included most of those books. I think it included 19 of the 27. And so the canon was more discovered than it was dictated. And those certain writings rose to the top. And some were disputed. James was disputed. Hebrews was disputed. But in the end, the books that were chosen had been seen largely as authoritative from very early on. And it didn't have anything to do with the Roman Catholic Church trying to make a power grab. But as I said, we will talk more about that next year. So the content is far too counterproductive for the Gospels to be legend. So the first argument is that it's far too early to be legend, and the second one is the content is far too counterproductive to be legend. What does that mean? How are they counterproductive? Yeah.
If they were made up, then the church could have manipulated it so Jesus would be agreeing with them on everything.
Yeah. Do they tell embarrassing stories about themselves in those Gospels? Yeah, they do. And Mark records. Remember, Mark is recording the recollections of Peter. What does Jesus say to Peter when he's saying, "I'm going to go to Jerusalem and die"? And Peter says, "No, we won't let that happen." What does he say? Get behind me. He basically calls Peter Satan. That's embarrassing, right? I don't think anyone wants to be called Satan, but particularly not by Jesus. And they are dim-witted. They don't understand. They don't believe until they actually see Jesus. And they tell all of these stories about themselves that if they're wanting people to believe that this is a true religion, that this Jesus really was Messiah, if you were making up a story, that is not the story you would make up. And in particular, who were the first witnesses of the resurrection? Women. You never make up that story in ancient Israel. Women weren't even allowed to testify in court because they were seen as unreliable witnesses. In fact, even, I don't know which gospel it's in, but they go and tell the disciples, he's risen. And they're like, no. And then it says, because they assumed it was a fairy tale because the women told them. And so now the disciples are looking bad again. When you are writing a story that you are trying to get someone to believe, a lie, and you're writing a lie that you know is a lie, and here's what's so important about that. The disciples, if it didn't happen, they knew it. So they knew they were writing lies, right? And so they went to their deaths for a lie that they knew was a lie. So they wrote this warts and all picture of themselves. Why? Because it's true. Because that's what happened. Otherwise, they'd write a glowing account of how we all knew, we ran to the tomb because we knew he was rising, and we stood there as he rose from the dead. No, that's not the story that they wrote. So the content is far too counterproductive. And then the third reason is the literary form of the Gospels is too detailed to be legend. And we touched on that. But C.S. Lewis wrote this: I have been reading poems, romances, vision, literature, legends, and myths all my life. He was not a religion professor. He was a literature professor at Cambridge, no less. I know what they are like. I know none of them are like this. Of this gospel text, there are only two possible views. Either this is reportage, so like in a newspaper telling a true story of what happened, or else some unknown ancient writer without known predecessors or successors suddenly anticipated the whole technique of the modern novelistic realistic narrative. And that's impossible. to have happened. We have novels now that are fake stories that give detail. That kind of writing was unheard of in that day, unless it was, and that was even after Jesus' time. But unless it was, the Greek tales, but those didn't read like a true story. They were obviously not a true story. Okay. Okay, so we're going to stop there. And if you would please take out your little atheist books and turn to we go through all of 1 through 8 on the equip. We talk about all of that. Okay. Okay. Oh, so 1 through 4, read pages. You've probably done Engage 1 through 3 already, right? Have you? Do the Engage questions 1 through 4, and finish reading the chapter for Monday.
Yeah, we're not sure what it is.